Hi, Jerry McLaughlin with Special Ops. Our topic today is how God redeemed the doctor who gave America legalized abortion. But wait a moment, there's a good turn to the story. He didn't continue, well, it won't be a plot spoiler. We'll introduce our guest, WND.com. Everybody's heard of it. And the main man there right now is David Kupelian. Hello, David. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Jerry, good to be with you.
Now, there was a group called NARAL, Naral, and the co-founder was Bernard Nathanson, a medical doctor who performed abortions. A lot of interesting things you've written about. One of them I'm curious about is the name pro-choice, how that ever came to be. Were they serious about it? Were they joking? I think you've written about that as well. Go ahead. Tell us about this story.
Yeah, I actually interviewed Bernard Nathanson, who was the co-founder of NARAL, which NARAL is kind of the most belligerent pro-abortion group today, but they had a different name back then. It was the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. That's what they were up to. And back in the 1960s, that's when this abortion was legalized in certain states before Roe versus Wade in 1973. And NARAL was the vanguard group that did all the heavy lifting, that convinced the media and the legislatures to legalize abortion. And so here is Bernard Nathanson, a self-described Jewish atheist. He's a doctor, and he is the main promoter. As far as doctors, he's the main guy that gave us legalized abortion. And the remarkable thing, a lot of things has been said about him. He even wrote a book. I have a copy of it here. It's called The Hand of God, A Journey from Death to Life by the Abortion Doctor Who Changed His Mind. So he had a remarkable journey. He pushed hard to get abortion legalized. As far as what you said about, was it serious or was it just marketing? He told me that he remembered sitting around a table with a group of people, Betty Friedan and others in the vanguard of the pro-abortion movement. And he says, I remember laughing when we made up these slogans like a woman's right to choose and, who decides? And they reframed the debate away from like, are you killing a precious little human being to, who is going to decide this most important decision of a woman's life? A woman and her doctor, or politicians and bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. And when you phrase it like that, I almost you want to side with them, because who wants politicians and bureaucrats to decide anything for us?
Well, back on January 22nd, 1973, when Roe versus Wade got ruled by the Supreme Court, paving the way for quote unquote legalized abortion, a lot of people would differ with that in terms of what makes it legal. Just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't necessarily mean it's final. I mean, Congress could override. There's a lot of things could happen, but it hasn't. So as a result, for many, many years, and at least 60 million abortions later, we're talking about a medical doctor joking around about terms like pro-choice. And then it got crazier. People start calling pro-lifers anti-choicers, as if we're against choice. I mean, just a phrase like that. Boy, I wish he would have turned against abortion a lot sooner. We probably would have had a lot less babies killed, although there would have been other people that stepped up to the bloody plate and probably done what he did. How did his life actually turn around? A man who was responsible in large part for 60 million dead babies. What turned his life around?
Here's the amazing thing, Jerry. At the time that I interviewed Nathanson, which was almost exactly 30 years ago, it was for a cover story for a magazine I was working for. And he, at that time, had turned completely against abortion. He spent the rest of his life actually trying to put the genie back in the bottle. He was really heroic in what he did. But he did not believe in God. He said that his change of mind on abortion had nothing to do with God, although from my perspective, I'm pretty sure God was pushing him along this path eventually, because eventually he converted to Christianity, and that's hence the name of his book, The Hand of God. It's quite a wonderfully transparent book, very honest, and he describes actually, and I'll get to it in a minute, what actually changed him around to become a Christian. But I just want to make the point that he himself, he told me it had nothing to do with religion, because remember, he was not a Christian at the time I interviewed him. He was still an atheist, but he turned totally against abortion simply because, and this is the problem with OBs, with obstetricians that are delivering these little miracles that come from a submicroscopic sperm and an egg. In a few months, it turns into this fantastically beautiful human baby. And they are delivering these little miracles every single day, unless you have a really hard heart, a really seared conscience. You're just sort of somehow, cauterized shut from reality. You eventually going to say, what am I doing? And there are many other abortionists, former abortionists, Jerry, in my book, The Marketing of Evil, the chapter on abortion, there are interviews with 8 different abortion doctors and clinic owners and nurses, one of whom is Bernard Nathanson, who all changed their mind on abortion. One day, like, I'll just tell you one thing, there's a nurse and she's looking at the pieces. This is grotesque. They have to look at all the pieces to make sure they got it all. And she's looking at it. She's done this thousands of times before, but one day, something happens. She just says, my God, this is a human being. It's the touch of God. So everything was the same, but something in her consciousness, her understanding changed. So Nathanson said it was the ultrasound, the amniocentesis, the fetoscopy, the other technologies that were coming into being in the 60s and 70s that gave you a, quote, window into the womb, that allowed them to see, my gosh, the little baby is heart beating, he's urinating, his eyes are moving around. It's just all these things. He said, I realized, my God, this is my patient. I have to, this is not something that I can exterminate. So he had this sort of secular epiphany about abortion. And at the time that I interviewed him in 1990, he was still, by his own reckoning, an atheist, okay? But about 6 years later, 6 years later is when he was actually baptized into the Catholic faith, John Cardinal O'Connor in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. He, if you ask, like in this book, toward the end of this book, he explains what happened. How did he find God? And I will summarize it this way. He credits Operation Rescue and the pro-life demonstrators. They were sitting out there on the cold, rainy days, and they were being attacked and being mocked and jeered at by the pro-choicers. They were being arrested, they were being fined, they were being abused by the news media, who were all very pro-abortion. And he marveled at how they sat there totally serenely, singing and praying and totally confident of the eventual outcome of what they were doing in the middle of all this moral and legal chaos. And if it's okay, Jerry, if I could just read a couple lines that he writes toward the end of this book, where he says, I began watching these people, these Christians sitting there, praying for him. He says, I began to seriously question what indescribable force generated them to this activity. Why too was I there? What had led me to this time and place? Was it the same force with a capital F that allowed them to sit serene and unafraid at the epicenter of legal, physical, ethical, and moral chaos? And then he says, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I began to entertain seriously the notion of God, a God who problematically had led me through the proverbial circles of hell, only to show me the way to redemption and mercy through his grace. He says, the thought violated everything I had learned. He said, it instantly converted my past into a vile bog of sin and evil. It indicted me. He goes on, high crimes against those who had loved me. He says, but simultaneously, miraculously, it held out a shimmering sliver of hope to me in the growing belief that someone had died for my sins and my evil 2 millennia ago. And that is how he explains in his book, The Hand of God, kind of the magic moment that turned him around. Although he explains this was a gradual growth in him, but that was one of the main things that pushed him over the edge and made it really real for him. And Nathanson died at the age of 84 in 2011. But to his dying day, he worked tirelessly to end the abortion holocaust that he had ushered in.
Okay, 21 days, 21 years before Dr. Bernard Nathanson's death was 1990 when you were interviewing him. That also happens to be the year that was the peak of my personal pro-life abortion protesting. I was publishing a little newsletter called Rescue Network News, which for all the independent rescue groups. You had Operation Rescue was the big one. I had booked Randall Terry on his first Oprah Winfrey show back in 1988 as being his publicist. And represented any pro-life group. I didn't care if there was just two people. I remember there's a guy in Chicago there who was always in front of every abortion clinic for every protest you could shake a stick at. Jay Huddle, who's passed away since. I would show up and do the publicity for him, even if he was the only one there, and he'd chain himself with a lock, a kryptonite lock, to the front of the abortion clinic and shut it down single-handedly for half a day and so forth. But yeah, I remember those days. I was arrested in front of a Chicago abortion clinic. I was even arrested in front of a hospital when I was just calling in a story about abortion protests. They just would literally rip you off of a cell phone in those days, throw you in jail, and you don't have rights. And then I would go to the court later and say, here's my phone bill showing I was calling the media, covering this as a news reporter. And the judge was a smart aleck, says, well, unless you can bring Mr. Bell here, I'm finding you guilty. It's like, what do you mean, Mr. Bell? Alexander Graham Bell is, yeah, bring Mr. Bell here. I go, this is a genuine Bell phone bill. Here it is. This is my bill. It says, he kind of snickered and guilty as charged. I was there with a lawyer and everything. We would get nailed all the time with those things. Abortion is so deep seated, it's pathetic. There's so many people that really are on the wrong side of the issue. It's so good that Bernard Nathanson did turn around. Do you know of any other, you mentioned other abortionists that turned around as well. I didn't know there were that many. I do remember when Nathanson did, because I was actively involved in the pro-life movement in those days with Joe Scheidler with Operation Rescue, Pro-Life Action League, and a lot of groups that were out there that contributed to about 80,000 people, including myself, being arrested.
Yeah, there have been a number of them. The names don't fly to my mind right now, but there are some, and they are like Nathanson. They are single-minded in trying to turn this around, and they have incredible credibility because nobody can say they don't know what they're talking about. The Nathanson had established the Larson at that time the largest abortion clinic in the country. He personally performed 5,000 abortions. He personally oversaw 10,000 more, and his clinic did another 60,000 in 2 years. The Crash Clinic in East Manhattan. That's about 100 abortions per day. They had 10 operating rooms. Okay, so people like this are, nobody can say, oh well, they've never been there. They don't know what they're talking about. And then oh dear, who was the lady in the Unplanned movie? They had this movie. Her name skips my mind right now, but she managed a Texas Planned Parenthood, and they made a marvelous movie, Unplanned. Also, the Gosnell movie. There have been a lot of things that have awakened people in this country to the reality of abortion. And if I mentioned Gosnell, I just want to say, Kermit Gosnell is serving 3 life terms right now for 3 murder one convictions. One of the great truths that came out of that whole thing, that the trial, and then the movie that was made of it, which was very good.
Are you talking about the one with Ashley Bratcher in it? She written by Abby Johnson, Unplanned. Yeah, I think that was that.
Abby Johnson. Yeah, that was the Unplanned one. That's the name I couldn't think of. Who ran the abortion clinic? She is wonderful now. She has a ministry that's aimed directly at bringing people out of the abortion, the personnel, the staffers out of Planned Parenthood and other abortion clinics, and has had hundreds of them leaving. Okay. And so you have, I was just saying, Gosnell, what Kermit Gosnell did that got him landed into life in prison is no different from what all the other late-term abortionists do. Okay, this is something even mainstream media had to take note of. It was almost revolutionary because what he did, he killed little babies at the same age, gestational age, uh, health, value, preciousness, every measure as are killed every day in this country. Okay, but what he did was he took the baby out of the mother first, and then he killed it. If he had left it like 10 inches this way and the other side of the birth canal and done the same exact thing, it would have been, oh, women's reproductive health care, and an exalted constitutional right. But what he did was a grisly murder. Okay, they were precisely the same things. And so I think this was something that really served to, and I actually wrote about this in my most recent book, The Snapping of the American Mind. This was one of those instances that pierced through the denial of the public. Because look, abortion is based entirely on denial. Okay, the idea that the little baby growing in the womb is just a clump of tissue until the moment it's born, and then suddenly it's a beautiful, precious baby. But 5 minutes before that, it was just a clump of cells, is just way beyond idiotic. Okay, and everybody plays along with it, meaning people I've been in the news media for 40 years. People in my profession, they mostly play along with it because they are convinced, going back to Nathanson and the early abortion marketers, that this is a liberal, enlightened thing to do because women need to have the sexual freedom to not be stuck with the baby if they get pregnant. And once you make that your highest priority, everything else has to fall in line. You have to be able to murder little babies in the womb, because if you make that sexual freedom the most important thing, without the consequences of, sex causes babies, in case people didn't know, that's where babies come from. And if you make it a sort of a cultural touchstone, that our freedom we define as be able to have sex with whomever, wherever, in whatever circumstance we want, and not be responsible for the outcome. If that's your marker you're putting down, then it follows that no matter how hideous, okay, you're talking infanticide, okay, it has to be legal, because you can't have it both ways. And that they've determined that's the way they want to have it. And now they've gone so insane, they're talking about, men getting pregnant, and we've gone like even further into craziness. But the denial.
You wrote in WND, I think you wrote in WND.com. WN is in Nancy, D is in David.com, for anybody who hasn't been there before. I think most of us have. I read a quote. It says, quote, "Repeating the big lie often convinces the public. The number of women dying from illegal abortions was 200 to 250 annually. The figure was constantly fed to the media, though, was 10,000. These false figures took root in the consciousness of Americans, convincing many were needed to crack the abortion law."
Right. You are, Jerry, you're quoting Bernard Nathanson to me in that interview 30 years ago. He is confessing how they did it.
This is your article, and your book also on this about Bernard. Give us the name of your book again and where we can get hold of it.
Oh, well, the book with Bernard Nathanson is The Marketing of Evil. And the more recent book that has the chapter about Gosnellis, The Snapping of the American Mind. Jerry, if your listeners want to read the article about Bernard Nathanson, it's lengthy and it has all this in it. The best way to do it is just to go to my archive. It has all of my WorldNet Daily articles, and it's just davidkupelian.com. It's
That's
David
Kupelian, davidkupelian.com.
Yeah, and that's the top article in there is about Bernard Nathanson, about the abortion doctor that how he found God. Basically, it's a wonderful story, because his story is a wonderful story. I'd like to say, just Jerry, the amount of guilt that this man had to be carrying for personally performing that many abortions, but not only that, being the man, as much as anybody else, that ushered in this over 62 million abortions now in America in the last 48 years. It really is a testimony to him that he could face that, okay, and even much more, a testimony, if I may say, to the mercy of Almighty God, that he could forgive and cleanse and help a guy like Bernard Nathanson, who did this, as the Apostle Paul said, because he was a bad guy too. He was persecuting people and persecuting Christians before he got stopped on the road to Damascus. And he says, I did these things in ignorance and unbelief, I think are the words he used. So This was Bernard Nathanson. His training, everything led him to this, but somehow the touch of God brought him to make a complete about face. And the fact that he could end up his life in peace with the forgiveness of God through Christ, with that kind of a guilt load on him, it's really a wonderful story. His book, he's a wonderful writer, by the way. If you read his book, The Hand of God, you can get a shortened version of it and his whole history of it in the article that I wrote about him.
It's nice that abortionists have repented and gone 180 degrees the other way, but also the very woman who was the center part of the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision was Norma Mccarvey. I've met her. I've talked to her before. I even booked her on some interviews in the past while she was alive. And she basically explained how they railroaded her into it, used her as a poster girl for abortion and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, she had her baby. I mean, it's...
Yes, never had the abortion.
If you look at the history of this, the so-called true believers, Norma McCarvey's not a true believer in abortion. The abortion doctors eventually turned on it too. And all the polls, as you've written about in WND.com and this article and others, well over half the people are against abortion in some form or another. Now, it gets a little dicey sometimes when some people think, well, if you get the baby right after conception, maybe it's okay then, but certainly not for 9 months later. There's different levels that people look at it, when in reality, it's all life. Any way you look at it, abortion is murder, no matter what, and you really have to treat life as sacred. But overall, Americans are against it. So how has something like this gone on for so many years with so many people against it? I would like you to explain that one, and then for good measure, explain how on earth a guy like Joe Biden, who's for abortion, got in there against public will, when the most people I ever remember coming to one of his rallies was 150 people with cars, in a drive-in movie where like a car 10 feet apart parked there. Whereas Trump, even his going away rally, had more people at it than Joe Biden's inauguration.
Well, Jerry, we'll probably get thrown off the internet for my saying this because this is illegal speech now, but there was voter fraud. Okay. We all watched it every day in real time for 2 months. We saw the video of the people, shooing out the Republicans out of the room and then going and pulling out the suitcases of Biden votes from under the desk. Okay. We watched the video of Ruby, what's her name, feeding the same Biden votes through the machine again and again and again. We had the hundreds of pages of sworn affidavits, sworn under penalty of perjury. That's a felony. You can go to prison. Okay, saying that yes, we watched the voter fraud going on, and now suddenly we've got thousands of troops in Washington D.C. And if you say, but there was voter fraud, okay, then you get thrown off the internet. And also, Jerry, when I say the election was rigged, I add in, as a member of the media, the fact of big tech and big media, what they did, banning the New York Post story on Hunter Biden a week before the election, where polls have shown that enough Biden voters said, I wouldn't have voted for him if I'd known about that, would have changed the outcome of the election, period. That's rigged just on Twitter banning the New York Post story. So with that, you have the entire media, everything, obviously, between the media and the big tech and the voting, it was a rigged election.
Okay, David, what I would say, if I were to paraphrase it, I would say what these people are doing, big government, big tech, big media, they are basically marketing evil. They're marketing evil. They're basically promoting it in ways that are appealing to people by certain catchphrases, and then other areas where it's restraint of trade. Robinson-Patman Act of 1957 would make that illegal, among other things, racketeering, RICO, all sorts of things you could throw against them for that. But they are marketing evil. Now, you have a book by that same name, which I think is evergreen. I believe it's a classic, The Marketing of Evil. Tell us a couple of the chapters in that book and how you've covered this as well.
You know what's interesting about that, Jerry? The chapters cover abortion, church-state separation, the progressive takeover of education, the whole gay rights movement, which is now called the LGBTQ and so forth. It goes over all of the cultural and political things. But it's interesting the way you led into that, because at the very end of the book, I make a statement as a journalist for the past 40 years that I say that there is no institution in America that is more complicit, more guilty for making evil look good and good look evil than the news media. And I have a new updated version of The Marketing of Evil that will be coming out later this year. Okay. And I'll be doing a new chapter on it. And that new chapter will essentially say, that's what I said back there in 2005 when the original book was written. And it was you know, I don't want to say prophetic, but it was certainly prescient, because that is exactly what we found. The news media are more, I mean, they were liberal when you and I were young. Okay. We're always liberal, but now they are, they're Pravda. Basically, you know, Pravda was, if anybody doesn't know, Pravda in the USSR was the fake news media. It was you know, a ministry of truth that whose job was to carry water for the communist government in the USSR, but they pretended to be news media, and that's basically what we have now. They have.
There's one big difference, and by the way, I want to add that 15, 16 years ago, when he came up with The Marketing of Evil, by the way, the book is by David Kupelian, Kupelian. It's a classic. People thought you were carrying a little bit too far. Even I thought, when I first got the book, I thought, you know, maybe, I mean, I'm with this and everything, but I mean, is it possible that he's carrying a little too far? I have to say you're guilty as charged now for not carrying it far enough, because what you said in the book not only happened, but more happened. In fact, it's gotten to the point of cultural Marxism. It's not just socialism. I mean, it's literally the big media. It's all one big cabal. People used to think it had to be done through government. You had either Marxism, where you have no God, or a lukewarm state-sanctioned church, like they had a couple churches in the USSR that were allowed by the state. Or you'd have like Nazism, like fascism, where it's still like Marxism, except they let you hold the title deed to your house, but it doesn't do you any good because they completely control it anyway. So whether they allow you to have no private property as communists, or private property in name only or title only, but in reality it's like communists, that'll be fascism. And the craziest thing is all these the Marxist groups, communist groups, are calling us the fascists and Donald Trump the fascist. They got it completely reversed. They are the fascists or the communists or the Marxists, and they're mixing up the terms. I mean, we're capitalists, we're conservatives, diametrically opposed to fascism. How do they get away with that? How on earth do they get away with that? And just because the media doesn't call on them, or what?
You know the Bible verse that talks about woe unto them that call evil good and good evil and so forth. So what we call that today in psychological terms is projection, where it's a psychological thing where people project their own problems onto other people. Okay, but when you're talking about in politics and culture, it is a battle tactic, and it's what the left does. They are constantly accusing which this is why we have all these troops in Washington right now. Their current projection is to accuse conservatives of being terrorists. We have been watching, you know, Marxist, anarchists, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, you know, burning down America's cities for the last year. That's why where I live in Oregon, the real estate prices are sky high. Everybody's moving out of the city. They want to move to Idaho or Tennessee or someplace out of California, out of Chicago, out of the big cities, because the communists, anarchists, so forth, the Marxists have ruined our country, made it unlivable. But here you have like this Capitol riot, and they are literally comparing it to 9/11. They're comparing it to 9/11 and to Pearl Harbor, both.
Okay, now let's talk about projection. This is key here. Okay, when the riots have, well, besides the fact that when they're throwing bricks through plate glass windows and stuff like that in Oregon and Seattle and Kenosha and stuff like that, I mean, and calling that peaceful demonstration, and then when Trump says meet peacefully, redress your grievances, and then they call him an inciter of riots, etc. But basic projection, you take something as simple as the Russia hoax. It all started with the Russia hoax. did not Hillary Clinton have a deal with Uranium One, and they got a bunch of money sent to the Clinton Foundation, all this stuff? Wasn't she the one in bed with the Russians, not Donald Trump? And then they
Yeah,
took the word against that. They said that he was the Russian boogeyman. Wasn't that projection?
yeah, Jerry. Not only was Hillary colluding with the Russians, literally, okay, not just with the uranium sale, 20% of our strategic uranium, but also she was directly involved, including with the Russians in the Steele dossier and all that. She did precisely what they accused Trump of doing. But I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago, basically saying that the Democrats have been colluding with the Russians for like 100 years. Okay, this is if you go this. Okay, just to make it really simple, because we don't have a whole lot of time. If your listeners go to the Communist Party USA website, cpusa.org, okay, go look at it. Don't take my word for it. Just go look at it. This is the official website of the Communist Party USA, which came into being as a Moscow Kremlin directed and paid for party in the United States. Okay. I defy you to find any significant difference between what you see on cpusa.org, Communist Party USA, in terms of their politics, their culture, their concerns, their suggested solutions to things, their sensibilities about everything from racism to climate change to immigration. You find me a dime's worth of difference between that and what you see in today's Democratic Party.
Right.
There is none.
Here's the Democratic platform, essentially. They talk about the working class, the class struggle, forces for progress, working class, and the trade union movement, special oppression, exploitation. They're appealing to African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Native peoples, Muslim. By the way, I'm pulling a leg here. This is from the Communist Party USA that I read it from. But doesn't it sound just like Democrat Party, LGBTQ community? And what they do add in, I don't really see them talking much about this, farmers and rural population. Where do the Democrats appeal to farmers and rural population? The first 20 things or so I just looked at were just spitting image one and the same with the communists.
Yeah, I don't know. They pretend to be still the party of the working man, the common man, the laborer, and so forth. But more and more, what we're seeing is this is the party of the oligarchy, of the elites, the Silicon Valley elites, of Wall Street, of China. Basically, it's the party of billionaires, but they still have the gall to pretend that they are the party of. And this is more projection. Donald Trump was the guy who, for the first time in a long time, refreshingly really cared about our veterans, about our workers. They used to call Trump the blue collar billionaire. Okay, he worked with construction people. He had a genuine heart for just the average person. He genuinely cared about them, and he did wonders for unemployment and all the rest of it. But they say that, oh, Trump only cares about his billionaire friends and making them rich, but we're caring about the common people. More projection. Everything is the opposite of what they say. And by the way, Jerry, if I can just wax religious here for a moment, people try to understand the sheer madness that's rising up around us right now. And if you try to understand it strictly in terms of politics and and culture and money, you can understand certain parts of it, why certain sectors go along with it because they make a lot of money from it and so forth. But I commend to your listeners, go and read Romans 1. That's the famous passage where Paul basically says, hey, you people, if you are going to keep rebelling against God and his laws long enough and hard enough, eventually God's going to say, okay, have it your way. Let's see how that works out for you, okay? And he gave them over. It says he gave them over to a depraved mind and depraved thing. Read that and you'll say, oh yeah, that's like, that's written, 2,000 years ago, but that is exactly what we're seeing. And for me, that is the best, most satisfying, deepest explanation, because there is no real logical explanation They have a deranged mind, but then from their perspective, since they have seared consciences, okay, they're letting little kids commit suicide now because teachers won't go back to
Okay,
the
I would
classroom.
fast forward to Revelation 2, that when Jesus or Yeshua or Yahusha, depending on what language we're translating or transliterating his name into, he says to Laodicean church, I wish you were hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, I spew you out of my mouth. So a guy like Bernard Nathanson was cold for the things of God, but then he repented and he got hot. So with the same fervor he spent killing babies, he spent saving babies. But today the problem is we got a lukewarm Laodicea uh, populace out there because a lot of good times and they didn't have to go through a lot of struggles that our grandparents and great grandparents went through. And it gets to a point where outright communism, I'm going to read this to you, cpusa.org, Communist Party of the United States, cpusa.org, this is what they're saying. Socialism, communism slash socialism, with the active participation of millions, is sugar coated. It sounds good, doesn't it? Will usher in a new era. The great wealth of the USA will, for the first time, be used to benefit all people. Democratic rights will be guaranteed and expanded. Racial, gender, and social equality will be the basis of domestic policies and practices. Foreign policy will be based on mutual respect, peace, and solidarity. Socialism is not a dream, but rather a necessity to improve working class people's lives. It sounds really nice. And you talk to
Jerry,
those millennials nowadays. You say, well, they say like, what do you got against socialism? I like social networking. I like being social. They really don't understand. There's a very big difference between socialism slash Marxism. With the Great Leap Forward, and they study in schools of the Great Leap Forward. Oh yeah, in China, that was wonderful. 100 million people murdered. That was wonderful. That it went from a nice government in China, all of a sudden, boom, to communism. And today they're talking about rounding up our children, supporters of Trump, to reindoctrinate them. There's 100 and, I mean, that might be 150 children from 75 million Trump supporters and voters and so forth. What are they going to round this up in freight cars or something like that? What are they getting at? How on earth would they indoctrinate that many children if they were to separate them from their parents? Well, let's make this the last topic because we're over the clock here, but this has been very interesting because you're a wealth of information.
First of all, Jerry, what you just read from the cpusa.org website, if you just take out the word socialism, it sounded exactly like what Susan Rice and John Kerry and all these other people, the new people in the Biden administration, are saying. I mean, chillingly so. Okay, they're using different words, equity, which, by the way, marketing of evil, they're using the word equity a lot. People they hear equality. They think, well, that means equality. Equity is the opposite of equality. Equality, as Martin Luther King, we're judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. Equity means because of the color of your skin, we're going to use a different scale for you. So they're very sneaky what they're doing. Jerry, as far as like the indoctrination, okay, they're making noise about, we need to reprogram people. That's all they've been doing. How could they have people voting for a person like Joe Biden in the first place? Our schools are teaching the 1619 Project and all this white fragility and all this toxic garbage. Our colleges, of course, they are the most left-wing. The historian William Lynn describes our Ivy League colleges as little ivy-covered North Koreas. Okay, so this is what we've had this is why we're so mixed up. All these crazy ideas are coming from the academy.
Well, we've enjoyed the talk with David Kupelian. One of my favorite books is Marketing of Evil. It's like 20 books in one. Each chapter is on a different topic, like abortion and so forth, that explains exactly how they're sugarcoating things and marketing it to our children in schools and the media, etc. It's good to get a copy of that book plus his new one, so we can better argue the case with people. Thank you for being our guest. Got to have you back again. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jerry. Good to be with you.
Jerry McLaughlin back. Thanks for watching the show. If you enjoy these programs on special ops, please come to our main website, middleamericamedia.com. That's middleamericamedia.com. We got issues, politics, opinions, and so much more. Appreciate you.